Welcome, curious minds. We're about to embark on a deep dive designed just for you. Really a shortcut being well-informed without getting lost in all the noise. Today, we're tackling a really fascinating topic. The dialogue between civilizations, but seen through the eyes of a truly remarkable thinker.
Indeed. We're exploring the insights of Seyyed Hossein Nasr. He's one of the most prominent contemporary Muslim philosophers out there. And his perspective is quite unique. He spent a lot of his life in Western universities, first as a student, then as a professor. So that allows him to look at the West's intellectual shifts, its value changes, with a really rational eye. He's not just looking at it. He's trying to get to the soul of Western thought.
Right, his vantage point sounds like it gives a genuinely fresh lens.
Hmm.
So what surprising things does he uncover about this, let's face it, often difficult relationship between Western and Islamic civilizations? And what's our goal here today in exploring his work?
Well, our mission really is to unpack that perspective. We want to challenge some common assumptions people might have, maybe bring some surprising facts to light. We'll touch on his own involvement in global talks, his critique of modernity, which is quite sharp, and his hopes for maybe a different kind of future, a more cooperative one.
Okay, that sets us up perfectly. Let's dive right in with a big one. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. How does Nasr actually engage with that theory? It's so well known.
Yeah, it is. And Nasr, well, he strongly opposed Huntington's whole thesis right from the start, even before it got famously published in Foreign Affairs. He basically saw it as lacking real scientific rigor. He felt it was driven more by a pre-planned agenda than by objective, inquiry.
Wow, so he saw it coming. And he didn't just disagree passively, you're saying he actively worked against it. Can you give us an example of how he challenged it practically?
Absolutely. A really key example was his immediate reaction to Huntington's article. Nasr was at a conference in Malaysia, and he proposed organizing a counter-conference. The specific aim was to demonstrate the common ground, the existing commonalities between Islamic and Chinese civilizations, which of course directly contradicts Huntington's framework. And that was actually the first initiative like that in the Islamic world. It did happen too with support from Anwar Ibrahim, who was Malaysia's deputy prime minister then.
That's quite a bold move, an act of intellectual defiance, really. It also suggests that for Nasr, this idea of dialogue isn't just a reaction to Huntington, it goes deeper, right? What do you mean by that?
Precisely. Yeah, that's a key point for him. Nasr emphasizes that the whole concept of dialogue, of peaceful coexistence between different peoples, it's much older than Huntington. It's older than, say, former Iranian President Khatami's initiatives, too. For Nasr, it's a much more fundamental idea, almost a sacred one, really, woven into how humans should interact.
That gives it important historical weight. Okay, so Nasr's opposition to the clash comes from this deeper place, especially his view on modernity itself. Can you expand on how his unique background shapes how he assesses Western civilization?
Sure. Nasr's philosophy, it really weaves together religion and nature and what he calls sacred science. He argues that historically people lived with nature. They saw it as sacred, a divine creation. They used it, yes, but didn't deplete it. But modern science, he says, it turned nature into a kind of dead entity, something separate from us, something to be completely dominated, exploited. And that, he argues, leads straight to its destruction.
That is a profound shift in how we see the world. Beyond the environment, what are the biggest consequences Nasr sees for societies that made this break, this move away from the sacred?
Well, it extends directly into his idea of sacred science. He believes that secularizing life, taking the spiritual dimension out of everything, it strips human existence of its roots. It leaves people in a kind of spiritual vacuum, in all parts of life. And this fundamental change, this loss of the sacred, that's what he thinks turned the West into what he calls a soulless civilization.
A soulless civilization, that's a strong phrase. It's painful, though, when you see things like Quran burnings or offensive films creating such deep divides. Given Nasr's rejection of the clash idea, how does he interpret actions like these? Are they part of a clash for him or something else?
He tends to see these incidents as orchestrated by specific individuals who actually profit from conflict, think arms dealers, or maybe those with political ambitions. Their goal, he thinks, is quite specific: to stir up tensions between Islam and the West, precisely to prevent any kind of rapprochement or real understanding. He also points out how, frankly, unprofessional and ridiculous some of these things are. Like that film Insulting the Prophet, he said he refused to watch it, but his students told him about it.
Okay, so if it's orchestrated by a few, how does he explain what looks like pretty widespread anti-Islam sentiment sometimes? Is it really a universal feeling in the West, or is the picture more complicated?
No, he's very clear on that. It's definitely not universal. Yes, the hostile current, the one trying to widen the gap, it gets a lot of media attention. It's highly visible. Like he gives the example, 1,000 Americans might read the Quran and nothing's reported. But one radical pastor, like Terry Jones, burns one, and it's headlines everywhere. But Nasr insists there's a strong, though often hidden, countercurrent in the West. People promoting tolerance, understanding. It just doesn't make the news because it's not sensational. The question he raises is, how can that current gain more influence?
That's a really important distinction, one that probably gets lost a lot. What about the term Islamophobia? We hear it constantly. How does Nasr approach that specific term?
Yeah, he finds that term Islamophobia, coming from the Greek phobia, meaning fear. He finds it problematic. He basically asks, fear of what?
Yeah.
He points out that Western powers control pretty much all the really destructive military technology. Islamic countries, comparatively, don't have that kind of advanced capability. So the idea that they genuinely frighten the West in a military sense strikes him as illogical. He traces this wave of anti-Islam feeling back mainly to the last 30 or 40 years. He remembers being a student at Harvard maybe 50 years ago, and Muslims were generally treated with respect by Jewish people, Christians, even atheists.
So if it's not genuine fear driving it, in his view, where did this hostility actually come from? What specific events does he think reignited these old tensions?
He links it to major geopolitical shifts and specific events, things like the Palestinian occupation, the Algerian War for Independence, the general independence of Islamic nations, and particularly the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That really defined Western expectations, creating this resilient Islamic system. He argues these events basically reactivated old animosities, framing Islam as an adversary again.
Interesting. And within the West itself, what about religious communities? Do they generally contribute to the hostility, or do they offer a different perspective in this dynamic?
Well, interestingly, Nasser points out that most religious Christians, in his experience, actually want rapprochement with Islam, not confrontation. He sees dialogue between religions as fundamentally logical, actually essential for any broader dialogue between civilizations. And he also notes a kind of surprising trend. Despite all the negative propaganda, Islamic studies departments in major Western universities, especially in the U.S., are actually thriving. They often get significant funding because student interest is high. Sometimes they even help support other departments. That, to him, suggests a real underlying desire for understanding, even if it's not always visible on the surface.
Connecting this back to the bigger historical picture, then, how does Nasr see this whole relationship between the West and the Islamic world evolving, especially around this concept of otherness?
Yeah, this is fascinating. Nasr's view is that Western civilization, especially back in the Middle Ages, largely defined itself in opposition to the other. And that other was primarily Islam. Even though, and this is crucial, the West benefited immensely from Islamic sciences, philosophy, math, astronomy, medicine, you name it, this sense of otherness persisted. It was part of forging a distinct Western identity.
Right, so the knowledge was absorbed, maybe even respected on some level, but at the same time, an identity was being built in contrast to the Islamic world. How did that tension play out later on?
Well, he argues that the kind of widespread hatred of Islam people often associate with the Middle Ages actually got more intense during the Renaissance. That period, followed by colonialism, really solidified a Western view that their civilization was the only truly valid one. And that led to terms like civilized becoming almost exclusively synonymous with Western values. He points out that if you look at classical Arabic or Persian texts from, say, 7 centuries ago, they didn't use civilized in that narrow, exclusive way.
That's a really powerful point about language shaping how we see things. So this idea of Western civilization as the standard, the only real one, it hardened then. What were the effects of that mindset?
Exactly. He highlights how in the 18th century, the French word civilization, civilisation, explicitly meant Western civilization as the perfected form. Other cultures were seen as just sort of preliminary stages on the way. And of course, the huge colonial conquest happening at the time reinforced this view. But this absolute view did start to shift a bit. By the 19th century, you see growing interest in other civilizations, like the German philosopher Goethe's deep admiration for the Persian poet Hafiz Shirazi. And after World War II, there were significant efforts to set up institutions for religious and cultural studies, trying to preserve non-Western cultures. But then, unfortunately, these more positive trends got disrupted again by major political events, the occupation of Palestine, the Algerian War, independence movements, and especially, as we mentioned, the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That last one in particular was perceived in the West as a kind of resurgence of Islamic power, and it really reignited those historical animosities.
Okay, so When we talk about dialogue today, some people worry it's a kind of trap, a way for Western culture to maybe overpower or assimilate other cultures. How does Nasser address those fears, especially the ones coming from within Islamic communities? You mentioned this idea of cognitive seizure. What is that exactly?
Right. Many people in the Middle East and North Africa do worry about that cognitive seizure.
Right.
The fear is that engaging in dialogue might lead to Islamic civilization being sort of intellectually absorbed or assimilated by Western ways of thinking. But Nasr, well, he doesn't fully buy into that fear. He points back to the Quran itself, which encourages consultation and dialogue. There's the verse, and consult them in the matter. He believes that real dialogue, if it's based on sound principles, doesn't automatically mean weakness or giving in.
Can you give us some historical examples he uses? Examples of this kind of open, confident dialogue from Islamic history that he sees as a model?
Definitely. He often points to the early Islamic centuries, the so-called Golden Age. You had scholars like Ibn Sina al-Biruni engaging in really open, robust debates with people of other faiths, including Christians like John of Damascus, who actually wrote critical texts about Islam while living peacefully right there in Damascus. Nasser stresses that this kind of engagement didn't weaken Islam. If anything, it strengthened it. It led to the flourishing of disciplines like Kalam, that's Islamic scholastic theology, a very rigorous field. Even later, during the Safavid era, you had scholars like Sayyid Ahmad Alawi, who was a student of the famous philosopher Mir Damad. Alawi wrote refutations of Christian beliefs, but he did it through logical, reasoned argument, not just emotional attacks. So this rich history shows dialogue is really foundational to the Islamic intellectual tradition.
So the key for Nasser seems to be confidence. Confidence in your own identity, your own tradition, allows you to engage without fear. What happens then, in his view, if a dialogue just hits a wall, if there's a fundamental disagreement?
Exactly right. He says if you're free from an inferiority complex, if you're confident in your own values, there's really no reason to fear dialogue. And if it reaches an impasse, well, Muslims can simply conclude with that Quranic verse, to you your religion and to me my religion. Lakum dinikum waliya din. He actually thinks dialogue helps Muslims understand the West better and also helps them offer valid critiques of the West. It's not just about being understood, but understanding others too. It's not necessarily about winning an argument.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, looking at it from the other side, the Western perspectives on dialogue you mentioned, it's not all one thing. How does Nesder break down the different groups or attitudes he sees within the West towards engaging in dialogue?
Yeah, he identifies about 5 distinct groups. It's quite nuanced. First, there are those who feel their own civilization is maybe declining and they're actively looking to other cultures, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, for meaning, for something deeper. He points to the significant number of white American women converting to Islam as an example here. Second, you have those who respect other civilizations, want to coexist peacefully, seek friendship and understanding, but they want to maintain their own identity, often intellectuals, maybe church leaders. Third group is more pragmatic. They see dialogue as just a practical necessity in today's interconnected world, even if they aren't personally drawn to, say, Chinese or Islamic culture. It's just something we have to do. Then, fourth, there's a group, and he thinks it's growing, that is actually hostile towards other civilizations. They might use the language of dialogue, but really as a cover for that cognitive seizure we talked about, trying to impose Western thought. And finally, fifth, you have the radical fundamentalists who completely reject other civilizations and basically want to dominate the world alone.
Wow, that really does paint a much more complex picture than you usually hear. Okay, so given all these different viewpoints, and Nasser's point that no civilization is actually pure anyway, where do we even start? What's the common ground for a meaningful dialogue?
Right. Nasser emphasizes that point strongly. No civilization today, including the West, is monolithic or unchanged. He sees modern Western civilization as having deviated quite significantly from its own traditional Christian roots, especially after the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Secularism and materialism are dominant now, in his view. And he observes that even great traditional civilizations like China and India have been heavily influenced by Western modernity. They've lost some of their original character. China adopted Marxism, for example. India was deeply shaped by British colonialism.
But does he see any exceptions to that? Are there traditional civilizations that he thinks have held on to their core essence more effectively?
Yes, he does make a distinction there. He believes that the Islamic and Indian civilizations have, by and large, managed to maintain their core identity and their religious principles more strongly. You can see this, he argues, in the continued widespread practice of traditional religion in those parts of the world. He contrasts this with China and Japan, where, although Japan has kept some traditional arts, The religious beliefs in both have been significantly weakened or pushed to the margins.
Okay, so bearing that in mind that some have held onto their core more than others, but none are pure, what are the essential foundations he proposes for having a meaningful, even if imperfect, dialogue? What are the starting points?
He lays out three crucial foundations. First, any real agreement reached through dialogue has to be rooted in the spiritual and traditional foundations of the civilizations involved. It can't just be superficial or purely political. Second, we need to focus on shared human crises. Things like environmental destruction, widespread psychological distress, the constant pursuit of power. These are universal problems, and he argues they stem from neglecting those traditional and spiritual principles, so these shared problems offer common ground. And third, it absolutely must be based on mutual respect. Dialogue is pointless if one side is just trying to impose its views through force or manipulation. You need genuine acceptance of different viewpoints without fanaticism.
That makes sense. Now, beyond just talking, Nasr also talks about the need for cooperation of civilizations. How is that different from dialogue? What does he mean by cooperation, and why does he see it as so necessary today?
Well, he argues that if civilizations were completely self-sufficient, maybe cooperation wouldn't be essential. But that's just not the world we live in anymore. Our world is so interconnected now, and the challenges we face are so big that they demand we work together. He uses the analogy of an orchestra. Individual musicians can play fine on their own, but to make a symphony, they have to cooperate.
So it's really about recognizing our interdependence, especially when facing these huge global issues. Does this cooperation extend beyond just practical material problems?
Precisely. It's about interdependence. And yes, it absolutely goes beyond just material issues. He stresses that humanity faces global problems today that our ancestors just didn't encounter on this scale. Take environmental issues like pollution. It doesn't respect borders, right? Toxic stuff released in Siberia can end up affecting someone in Africa. And Western technology, which has become so dominant globally, makes this kind of international cooperation more vital than ever before. If civilizations don't learn to cooperate, he warns pretty starkly that neither we nor future generations will have a safe planet to live on. And yes, to your point, it does extend to spiritual and traditional matters too. Civilizations need to respect each other's whole worldview. He also specifically calls for reforming what he sees as a barbaric Western economic system and moving away from just endless consumerism. But doing that, he says, requires both sincere dialogue and diligent cooperation.
He also brings up, and you touched on this earlier, what he perceives as a significant media bias and how conflicts and tragedies are reported. Can you elaborate on that example he gives and how it relates to cooperation?
Yes, he highlights a really stark contrast. He points to the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Libya where 4 Americans were killed. That got days and days of nonstop media coverage in the West. But around the same time, dozens of Muslims were killed while protesting that offensive film insulting the Prophet, and those deaths got almost no attention from the same media outlets. He argues that basic human ethics and professional journalistic ethics demand that victims aren't treated selectively. No one should be seen as a second-class human just because they're not Western. He urges Westerners to really examine and change that flawed perspective, and he encourages other civilizations to engage confidently in dialogue while holding on to their own authentic spiritual and traditional roots. That imbalance in attention really undermines trust and makes cooperation much harder.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to more recent events in the region. Nasser also commented on the big political and social changes in the Middle East and North Africa over the last decade or so, often called the Arab Spring. What's his perspective on that really complex period? What did he see happening?
Yeah, he describes the Arab Spring as a lengthy and really convoluted process, not simple at all. He points to key events, like the military coup against Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, Morsi having had a more Islamic vision. He notes how global powers often try to influence these regional developments, trying to steer them to fit their own agendas, which can end up stripping these movements of their authentic national character. He also observes how some Arab governments just seem to blindly follow Western powers, trying to crush similar movements in their own countries, although he doesn't think they have total control over events.
So he's definitely concerned about external meddling, but it sounds like he also saw potential for genuine internal change, despite all the difficulties. What specific trends worried him most about how it unfolded, and where did he still see some hope?
Well, his main concern was that while a kind of awakening definitely started in several Arab countries, it got co-opted, or at least heavily influenced, by movements that are actually hostile to authentic, traditional Islamic thought. He mentioned specifically new Salafist and Wahhabist groups promoting quite hateful ideologies, particularly in places like Egypt and Syria. These groups often push very strict, literal interpretations, rejecting a lot of modern thought and sometimes advocating for quite extreme social and political systems. But despite that, he remained hopeful that over the long term, the Arab Spring could still mature into a genuine, positive awakening for the people in the region.
Were there particular countries where he felt more optimistic or more pessimistic about the outcome?
He was relatively optimistic about Tunisia. Egypt was more complex. He noted what he saw as the Muslim Brotherhood's arrogance over the years, but he ultimately placed his hope in the Egyptian people themselves, their consciousness, and their potential commitment to national reconciliation. Syria, though, he described as the most unstable Arab country by far, with this incredibly intense conflict fueled by foreign-backed factions. And he warned quite clearly that continued instability in Syria would inevitably spill over into neighboring countries, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, even potentially affecting Israel. His plea was for all the warring parties in Syria to act logically, to try and transcend the blind fanaticism, really, to protect their own people and their land.
So after this really deep dive into Seyyed Hossein Nasr's thinking, what are the main takeaways? We've covered his sharp critique of what he calls a soulless modern West, his whole historical view on otherness, and his call, which seems both pragmatic and deeply spiritual, for genuine dialogue and cooperation.
I think he powerfully reminds us that real dialogue isn't just talk. It requires genuine mutual respect. It needs a willingness to actually face our shared global challenges together, not by trying to force solutions or letting bias get in the way. And crucially, it demands that we understand our own traditions and values deeply before we try to engage meaningfully with others. That confidence is key.
And that leaves a really important question for you, our listener. In this world we live in, just bombarded with conflicting views and information overload, what does it actually mean to be civilized in the 21st century? And maybe more importantly, how can you personally contribute to fostering authentic understanding rather than just deepening the divides we see everywhere? Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.